getting into what will be a busy political season. The races for governor, lieutenant governor, all state house seats are all up for grabs. And parish president and council races in numerous parishes are also wide open. Tonight we'll talk this fall's elections as qualifying starts and ends this week. Who's in, who's out, and will there be any surprises? We're joined on the hot seat tonight by UNO political analyst Ed Chervenek and Xavier University political pollster Dr. Silas Lee. Let's just get right to it and start with the highest race in the state, the governor. Bobby Jindal is termed out. He's running for president. He's moving on. 4 people are currently out campaigning, planning on qualifying. U.S. Senator David Vitter, Lieutenant Governor Jay Dardenne, Scott Angelle, who's a public service commissioner, and then John Bel Edwards, who is a state lawmaker. Is David Vitter the perceived front runner right now, Dr. Lee?
Well, perception-wise, front runner, yes. However, we won't know anything until one to see if everyone qualifies, which we anticipate they will. However, there's still probably some moving parts to this. If someone decides not to run, someone might get in the race unexpectedly. I think that would upset the dynamics. But as of now, looking at Vitter and Bell, small percentage undecided. However, a lot of things can happen because the campaign really hasn't started yet. And until that really gels, we have to see how solid the support is. So I would say everyone should just hold on and wait to see what happens after Labor Day when we see massive advertising, campaigning, and how solid the support is.
You're seeing some advertising right now. We have 3 Republicans out of that 4, 1 Democrat, with John Bel Edwards being the only Democrat. Louisiana is a red state, no doubt. How do the 3 Republicans stack up, Ed?
Well, at this point, if you look at the polling, it seems like Angelle and Vitter are statistically tied. They seem to be kind of going back and forth in terms of who's the lead, and Dardenne seems to be coming up the rear. We've seen Angelle be very aggressive in his advertising, trying to raise up his name recognition numbers, and he seems to be successful at that. And we just seen some ads by David Vitter. We really haven't seen anything from Jay Dardenne or John Bel Edwards yet, and I think Silas is correct that it's after Labor Day when they'll really start to kick it in high gear and people will start paying attention.
David Vitter has ran some heated races in the past. 2010 against Charlie Melanson, 2004 against Chris Johns. Sitting congressman when he ran against them both times. Why is David Vitter looked at as such a good campaigner on the campaign trail?
Well, he's a survivor. He's been battle-tested against some very tough environments. So I think that's why it attracts attention. It attracts competition in many ways. And many people want to see, okay, if they can be successful at defeating David Vitter. And that's one of the things that enhances his mystique, the fact that he has been able to survive in a very contentious political environment when some people wrote him off.
And Ed, he survived one of the biggest scandals in Washington, D.C. in the last decade. That's what is, I don't know if you look at it as more impressive or incredible, as Silas said, that this was a huge scandal that he's already won 1 election after, and he's up now running for governor.
He's been very good at making the campaign about fellow candidates, his opposition. Defining his opponent and keeping the focus on his opponent rather than allowing the focus to be on him. And not only that, but he has a strategy of running against the president. So if he runs against a Democrat in the runoff, we'll definitely hear him running against the president because people dislike the president more than they dislike his alleged actions.
We saw it work last year with Bill Cassidy and Mary Landrieu. Let's talk about anybody who jumps into the race at the 11th hour. A lot of rumors, a lot of chatter right now that there could be last-minute people jumping in. Mayor Mitch Landrieu's name has surfaced. His camp is saying, no, 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 he's not running for governor, but he still has a couple of days to decide. If somebody like Mitch Landrieu gets in the race, how does that change the dynamic?
Changes the dynamics completely. Right now, John Bel Edwards is in a critical position to make it to the runoff. Mitch Landrieu gets in, then that peels away voters from John Bel Edwards. And that would also help someone like Angelle maybe make it to the runoff. So it changes the dynamics. And certainly Vitter would be very concerned about the interests of a Mitch Landrieu. Mitch Landrieu does have name recognition, resources, a base to run from. However, Mitch Landrieu would also be very concerned about what happened with his sister last year when she was defeated in the U.S. Senate race. Bottom line, Louisiana is a red state.
If anybody could run a sprint election, most people feel that Mitch Landrieu could for 60 days. Here's the big question, though, Ed, when it comes to somebody like Mitch Landrieu getting into this race. What would the logic be for him to decide to run? Why would he jump in the governor's race? Like I said, his camp says no, he's not. But what would the logic be for Mitch Landrieu to get in?
I mean, the only logic you could go into the contest with is that you're going to win. That he's going to devote the time and the resources to win. He has, 90% name recognition, and I wouldn't expect him to go into it unless he thought he was going to win. We'll probably see some additional people qualify. I think there's going to be more than 4 people who will qualify for the governor's race, and so it's really kind of hard to discern and determine how it's going to turn out.
Really quickly, John Georges is another name that you hear. He's run for mayor, he's run for governor. Do you think he jumps in the race? He obviously has a lot of money to spend, as he's shown before, if he gets into a race.
He might, but bottom line, he does not want to lose again. If he enters the race, he wants to win. And obviously, it would require him to spend a lot of time and resources to defeat well-financed candidates that you have in this race right now.
Well, he would probably run as an independent, and independents just don't do well. People tend to vote for either the Democrat or the Republican, and he may not be viewed as a serious candidate at this point. That he's gone on to other things, in the publishing world, and people kind of feel, okay, that may be your niche right now, and they may not be politics anymore.
Let's move on. Lieutenant governor's race. Right now, there are 3 big names right now. Kip Holden, the mayor-president of Baton Rouge, is polling first in a lot of polls. And then locally, John Young, who is the parish president in Jefferson, who's choosing not to seek re-election for that post, and former Plaquemines parish president Billy Nungesser. 2 Republicans, 1 Democrat. How do you think things shake out right now?
Well, it looks like right now with Kip Holden, consolidating the African-American vote is definitely enhanced his ability to make it to the runoff. Now, the dynamics can change in a runoff. If it's Kip Holden and John Young, then it's about turnout. It's about Kip Holden trying to not only hold on to his consolidated African-American vote, but expand his support, build a coalition. And that's where it's going to be very competitive, very difficult, and a challenge in terms of resources.
What about Billy Nungesser? He's the former Plaquemines parish president. He ran once before, lost to the current Lieutenant Governor Jay Darden. He's pretty much been campaigning for 4 years, though. Absolutely.
He's been out there raising money and also loaning money to his campaign. He built up certainly some recognition during Hurricane Katrina and the BP spill. You saw him on CNN all the time. He seems to be ahead in the polls right now. The problem with that race is that most people aren't even paying attention. I think 41% are undecided, and so people aren't really aware of the candidates for lieutenant governor, and so there's lots of room to grow for both Nungesser and for John Young.
Do you see that race getting ugly? It's the time of year where we start seeing ads, attack ads, punches being thrown left and right. All 3 of these gentlemen have been in elected office for a relatively long time. They all have records that their opponents can pick apart. Is that a race, even though people right now, like you said, Ed, may not be paying attention to? Do you expect that race to get heated as we get closer to the primary?
I would not be surprised. It's a very competitive environment, and these guys are in it to win it. Therefore, they will do what it takes to distinguish themselves from the competition and to have some momentum to win.
It's a full contact sport, and so negative ads are part of it. They're tried and true, and they're just part of the American tradition. We can go back to the framers, and they were slinging mud at each other at that time, so I wouldn't be surprised if it took place.
State House, something that has been very sleepy. The Senate and House, all seats up for grabs. A lot of these people, these ladies and gentlemen, are going to go back in, it seems, unopposed or with very little competition. Most of these races don't seem like they're going to be heated in Metro New Orleans.
It's difficult, I think. I think the most difficult thing for people today is to raise money. It's hard to convince people to open up their wallet and contribute money to you to defeat an incumbent. And it seems that that's been a trend in post-Katrina politics here, is that more and more incumbents seem to be kind of just voted right back in office without much opposition.
Well, you know, you look for an incumbent to have some vulnerabilities, and absent that is not attractive to someone challenging an incumbent, especially when an incumbent can, one, generate some resources, and two, they have the ability to call in favors from people they have helped to generate support. So that's what takes away the allure, I think, of attracting competitors to challenge an incumbent.
Real quickly, if I can have you answer this one as we're wrapping up. Dr. David Heitmeyer, the senator, pulled out of the race, says he has other things going on. That's a big district in New Orleans, Algiers, eats up parts of Plaquemines Parish. You're hearing a lot of names: Jeff Arnold, Troy Henry, Kristen Palmer, Troy Carter, Kristen Palmer. Is that going to be a race that's of interest to Metro New Orleans?
I bet it is. It's an open seat naturally for state senate. So anytime you have an open seat, that will attract people with a political pedigree as well as some new faces.
Absolutely. I think, yeah, it's going to be a hot race, hot contest.
All right, final question here. Jefferson Parish President. Right now, the two top candidates are Mike Yenny, the mayor of Kenner, and Elton Lagasse, the current councilman. It seems like that's a race that hasn't gotten off the ground. Not a lot of advertising, not a lot of commercials yet. Do you see anybody jumping in, and how do things shake out as that race moves forward?
I think that's going to intensify within the next couple of weeks after qualifying. Certainly Mike Yenny, he's younger, but Elton Lagasse, he does have the political support. So that's going to be a tough competitive race. I think after qualifying we will see some competition here.
Yeah, well, they're already engaged in the endorsement game. They're attending forums, trying to basically appeal to these various groups and get their endorsement. I think it's going to be very competitive. You know, I think the downside for Lagasse is that he's going to have to face questions about the leasing of the public hospitals and the whole debacle that's taken place there. And I think that's going to be a real problem for him. All
right. I wish we had more time, but we are unfortunately out of time. We will have more during qualifying this week. That is all for the hot seat. Ed Shervinek from UNO, Dr. Silas Lee from Xavier. We appreciate your time for being here. We'll talk to you much more during the election season. For now, that is all. Let's send it back to you at the news desk, Gina.